A billionaire murdered an innocent family to steal their land and cover his tracks. He thought his secret was buried for good, washed away by the sea. But he made one fatal mistake. He missed the girl, and he never counted on a Navy SEAL and his loyal K-9 partner buying the very fire lookout where the killing happened. They were searching for peace, but they walked into a war. The Pacific Northwest rain was so thick you could chew it. It clung to the windshield of the Jeep Gladiator, forcing the wipers into a frantic, squealing rhythm. The truck bounced and slid on the muddy logging road, little more than 2 ruts carved into the side of the forested Oregon coastline. Jack Cole kept both hands locked on the wheel, his knuckles white. He was a man of dense muscle and quiet intensity, with eyes the color of oxidized steel. Eyes that had spent the last 18 months scanning the tan deserts of the Middle East, trained to spot the subtle disturbances in the sand that signaled a hidden threat. Now, on his first real leave in 2 years, he found the suffocating green of the coastal forest almost claustrophobic. He glanced at the passenger seat. Ranger, his German shepherd, sat at perfect attention, eyes fixed forward. Ranger wasn't a pet. He was a partner, a 90-pound asset with specialized training in tracking and explosives detection. His coat was a healthy mix of black and tan, his ears perpetually alert. In the truck, he was technically at ease, but the tension in his shoulders never truly left. "Almost there, buddy," Jack murmured. The road finally crested a rise, and the rain thinned just enough to reveal it. The lookout tower. It stood on a rugged, black rock promontory, a stark wooden sentinel against the churning gray water. It looked exactly as the grainy government auction listing had shown, a classic 4-legged tower rising 100 feet, with a small, sturdy-looking ranger's cabin at its base, connected by a short, covered walkway. The property had been listed as decommissioned federal land, sold as is for a price so low Jack figured it had to be haunted, sinking, or both. He didn't care. He wasn't looking for luxury. He was looking for quiet. He brought the Jeep to a stop where the logging road dissolved into coastal grass. He killed the engine, and the silence he craved rushed in. Something was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of isolation. It was a heavy, pressurized void. Jack stepped out, the cold, damp air hitting his face. He could hear the ocean, a deep roar as the surf crashed against the rocks below the cliff. But that was all. No birds, no gulls crying over the waves, no swallows dipping, no shorebirds foraging at the water's edge. The air was dead. Ranger hopped out of the passenger side, landing softly on the wet grass. He shook himself once, the tags on his collar jingling, the only metallic sound for miles. He took 2 steps toward the cabin and froze. His entire demeanor changed in a microsecond. His ears flattened. The fur along his spine, from neck to the base of his tail, stood on end. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound Jack had heard before, usually seconds before violence. "Ranger, what is it?" The dog ignored him. His gaze was locked on the front door of the ranger's cabin 50 yards away. He lowered his head, sniffing the air, and the growl intensified, becoming a menacing, threatening snarl. "Easy, buddy," Jack said, his own senses suddenly flaring to life. Leave was over. This is an op. He scanned the perimeter. The dark windows of the cabin stared back like empty eye sockets. The lookout tower was silent. No movement, no immediate threat. "Ranger, heel." Ranger took a hesitant step back, bumping against Jack's leg, but he wouldn't break his stare. He was fixated on the cabin. "Okay, stay." Jack rested a hand on the dog's head, feeling the trembling tension. "Watch my 6." Ranger didn't relax, but he held his position. Jack trusted the dog's instincts more than his own eyes. Ranger smelled something he couldn't see. Jack moved slowly toward the cabin. The paint on the front door was peeling, blistered by salt and time. It was a deep forest green, faded and weathered. A heavy-duty brass padlock was affixed to a thick metal hasp, but the lock was open. Jack looked closer. This wasn't rust. It wasn't pride. The shackle, as thick as his thumb, had been cut. The clean, half-moon indentation of bolt cutters was visible on the metal. A professional cut, fast and efficient. Someone had broken in. His hand instinctively went to his hip for the sidearm that wasn't there. He felt naked. He had a hunting knife in his duffel and a tire iron in the Jeep. Not ideal. He backed slowly away from the door, rescanning the windows. "Anyone here?" He called out, his voice sounding flat in the dead air. Only the sea answered. He returned to Ranger. The dog's agitation had only gotten worse. He was now pacing, a tight, anxious circle, whining high in his throat. "All right, I get it. You don't like it." Jack went to the Jeep, grabbed his heavy maglite, and clipped his K-bar knife to his belt. "Okay, you and me, buddy. We clear the house like old times." Jack gave the command. "Ranger, search." It was the order to seek, to clear a structure. Ranger knew it as well as he knew his own name. And for the first time in the 3 years they'd been partnered, the dog refused. Ranger backed away, tail tucked, his eyes wide with something Jack had rarely seen in him. Fear. He let out a single, sharp bark that echoed strangely off the rock, and then he stood his ground. He would not go near that cabin. "What's in there, buddy?" Jack whispered. Ranger whined again, a desperate sound, looking from Jack to the cabin door and back. He was clearly in distress, not just aggressive. He was warning Jack away. Jack stood there, torn between his training and his partner's instincts. A cut lock, a silent coastline, a terrified dog. He'd bought this place to escape the feeling of being hunted. He looked at the cabin, then at the tall lookout tower beside it. The tower had its own separate, heavy metal door. "All right," Jack said, clicking his tongue. "Plan B." He walked toward the base of the lookout tower. Ranger now stuck so close to his leg they were practically tripping over each other. The dog kept looking back at the cabin, growling, refusing to take his eyes off it. Jack reached the tower door. It had a lock, too. This one was intact, but it was a simple, standard padlock. He pulled a small set of picks from his wallet. He hadn't spent 8 years as a SEAL without learning how to open a door. The lock clicked open in less than 10 seconds. He pushed the heavy steel door inward, revealing a spiral staircase ascending into blackness. The air that escaped smelled of rust, damp wood, and cold, stagnant oil. It was an unpleasant smell, but Ranger darted right in past his legs, sniffing the steps, his tail now back to a level, cautious alertness. Whatever was terrifying the dog, whatever evil had taken up residence on this promontory, it wasn't in the tower. It was in the cabin. Jack stepped inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him, the sound booming in the enclosed space. He looked up into the darkness, flicked on his flashlight, and began to climb. The spiral staircase was a narrow tube of iron and wood that coiled up through the heart of the tower. Jack ascended slowly, the beam of his maglite cutting a clean circle through the oppressive dark. Ranger followed silently, the soft click of his nails on the metal steps a comforting rhythm. The air grew colder with every turn. Jack could feel the immense weight of the Pacific pressing in from all sides. A constant, low-frequency hum vibrated through the soles of his boots. After about 100 steps, the staircase ended in a small, square room. This was the observation deck. A large alidade, a beautiful brass firefinder, sat dormant in the center. A narrow catwalk encircled the instrument, and 4 large windows gave a 360-degree view of the world. Jack stepped onto the catwalk, Ranger sitting at his feet, and looked down at the Ranger's cabin. From this vantage point, 100 feet up, the small wooden building looked like a model. He could see the whole layout, a single story, shingled roof glistening with rain, a stone chimney on the far side. His tactical mind took over, mapping the scene. 1 front door, 1 back door that led out toward the cliff's edge. 2 windows on the front, 2 on the side, facing the open ocean. Limited points of entry and exit. A classic kill box. He raised his flashlight, but its beam was swallowed by the rain. He didn't need it. He had his eyes. He watched the cabin for a full 10 minutes, motionless, letting his vision adjust to the gloom. He wasn't looking for a person. He was looking for anomalies. A pane of broken glass not visible from the ground. A curtain moving in a draft. He saw nothing. The cabin was a stone-cold tomb, but his elevated position revealed a new detail. A thin, dark line snaked across the floor of the covered walkway connecting the tower to the cabin. It looked like a drag mark. Something heavy had been pulled from the back door of the cabin toward the cliff's edge. He had to go in. Ranger's warning was a factor, but a potential crime scene took precedence. This wasn't his property anymore. This was an investigation. He descended the stairs, his mind working the tactical problem. He couldn't take Ranger. The dog's agitation would be a liability inside, potentially contaminating evidence or making too much noise. At the base of the tower, he cracked the heavy door. "Ranger, stay." He pointed to the bottom of the stairs. Ranger let out a low, pleading whine but obeyed. He lay down, his body a tense coil of anxiety, eyes never leaving Jack. "Good boy," Jack said, his voice low. "You're my overwatch. Bark if anything changes." He slipped out of the tower, easing the door shut, and moved across the wet grass to the cabin. The cut lock on the front door swung gently in the breeze. He took a deep breath, drew his K-bar, held it in a reverse grip, and pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. It was acrid and metallic, the coppery tang of old blood overlaid with the sharp, sterile scent of bleach. The combination was nauseating. Someone had tried to clean up. The scene inside was one of controlled violence. A wooden table and 2 chairs were overturned near a cold fireplace. Books had been swept from a shelf, their pages splayed on the floor. But it wasn't random vandalism. It was the result of a struggle. Jack's eyes followed the story written in blood. There was a dark stain on the floorboards near the door where the attack might have begun, then a smear leading toward the kitchen area. On the wall next to the kitchen entrance was a distinct spatter pattern, arterial spray, high velocity, a kill shot. He moved deeper into the cabin, his boots avoiding the darkest stains. Every surface was coated in a fine sheen of salty sea moisture, but beneath it, he could see the faint marks of scrubbing. They'd used brushes. They'd been thorough. From outside, a single, sharp bark. A report. Jack froze, listening, just the one bark, all clear. His attention was drawn to a faded bearskin rug in the middle of the main room. It was crooked, its edges curled as if it had been hastily thrown back into place. It was another anomaly. He nudged the rug with his boot. Underneath, as he'd expected, was a door, a square trapdoor flush with the floor with a simple, recessed pull ring. He knelt, wiped the ring, and pulled. The trapdoor lifted easily, its hinges recently oiled. The sharp smell of bleach billowed out, so strong it made his eyes water. He shined his flashlight into the darkness below. A short wooden ladder led down to a small, stone-lined root cellar. This was the source of the chemical smell, and it was the source of the blackout. The floor of the small cellar was littered with the shattered remains of electronics. A high-frequency marine radio was smashed to pieces. A satellite phone was in even worse shape. Its antenna was snapped, its casing cracked open to expose the circuitry. They hadn't just been broken. They'd been systematically destroyed. The killers had made sure no one could call for help. They had completely isolated their victims before, during, and after the attack. This was cold, professional work. Jack swept his beam around the small space. More scrub marks on the stone floor. Then he saw it. Tucked in a corner, half hidden behind a broken wooden crate, was a small, dark object. It wasn't broken electronics. It looked personal. He climbed down the ladder, his boots landing softly on the stone floor. He squatted, using the tip of his knife to nudge the object into the light. It was a photograph, no bigger than his palm in a simple leather frame. The glass was cracked. He picked it up by the edges. It was a picture of a man and a young girl, maybe 10 or 11, standing on the catwalk at the top of the lookout tower. The man had a kind, weathered face and a thick beard, his arm wrapped protectively around the girl. The girl had bright, intelligent eyes and a beaming smile, her brown hair blowing across her face in the wind. They looked happy. They looked like they belonged here. He turned the photo over. Written on the back in a looping script were 2 words. My Maya. A chill colder than the ocean air ran down Jack's spine. The professional killers, the meticulous cleaners who had destroyed everything had missed this one small, human detail in a sea of calculated brutality. A man and his daughter, Maya. Jack looked around the cellar, then up at the blood-soaked house above. Were they both killed here, or was it the girl? From outside, Ranger started barking. Not a single, sharp report. A frantic, furious, non-stop volley. Something had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. Ranger's frantic, non-stop barking was an alarm. It wasn't a warning. It was an alert of an ongoing threat. Jackson Cole pocketed the small, cracked photograph of the man and his daughter, Maya. His hand brushed the grip of his K-bar knife. He moved out of the cellar in a fluid, economical motion, taking the ladder and crossing the blood-stained floor of the small cabin in 3 strides. He burst out the front door, knife held low and ready. Ranger was 10 yards away near the base of the lookout tower, his body rigid, barking furiously at the sky. Jack followed the dog's line of sight. For a second, there was nothing but the oppressive gray rain. Then he heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the surf, the heavy whump 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 of rotor blades. A moment later, the aircraft sliced through the clouds. It was a sleek, black Augusta Westland helicopter, the kind favored by hedge fund managers and oil barons. It descended with an arrogant confidence, the rotor wash flattening the tall grass and whipping Jack's hair across his face. It touched down perfectly on a small, flat patch of ground between the cabin and the cliff's edge. Ranger! Jack yelled over the noise. The dog, hearing his voice, broke off his barking and came to Jack's side, taking up a position at his left heel. Ranger remained rigid, a low, threatening growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes locked on the aircraft. The engine spooled down, The rotors slowed. The side door slid open. The first man out wasn't the pilot. He was tall, wearing an expensive-looking dark suit, but his movements were all wrong for the clothes. He moved like Jack moved. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the overcast gloom, professionally swept the entire property. The cabin, the tower, the jeep, and finally, resting on Jack and Ranger. He was private security, expensive and well-trained. He stepped to the side, positioning himself as Overwatch. The second man emerged. He was in his mid-50s with perfectly coiffed silver hair. He wore no jacket, seemingly unaffected by the cold sea spray, dressed in a simple cashmere sweater, tailored slacks, and shoes that had clearly never touched dirt before. He radiated an aura of effortless wealth and absolute control. He smiled, a wide, white politician's smile, and walked toward Jack. Ranger immediately broke formation, stepping forward and planting himself directly between Jack and the stranger. The dog's growl deepened, the hackles on his back fully raised. "Easy, boy," Jack said quietly, resting a hand on Ranger's head. The man stopped about 15 feet away, holding up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Impressive animal," he said, his voice was smooth and cultured. "I take it you're Mr. Cole." The fact that he knew his name was the first red flag. "I am," Jack said. He did not offer his hand. "You're trespassing on private property." The man's smile didn't falter. "My apologies for the intrusion. My name is Marcus Sterling." He said the name as if it explained everything, and it nearly did. Sterling was a tech billionaire, a name synonymous with fiber optics, data centers, and most recently, ambitious undersea cable projects. "I own most of this valley," Sterling said, gesturing vaguely inland. "I suppose that makes us neighbors. I was flying out to my estate on the coast and saw your Jeep. I must say, I was shocked to see the old place has a new owner." Sterling's eyes flicked to the cabin, then back to Jack. The smile faded just a fraction, replaced by a look of practiced sympathy. "A terrible tragedy. What happened here?" Sterling said, his voice dropping to a respectful murmur. Jack kept his face neutral, his hand still resting on Ranger's tense shoulders. "Tragedy? You didn't know?" Sterling acted genuinely surprised. "Oh, my dear man, the realtor should have disclosed that. David Chen was the caretaker here. A good man, a real throwback, lived here with his young daughter. The community adored them." Sterling looked out at the churning gray Pacific. "About 3 weeks ago, a sudden squall came in. We get them on this coast. Vicious things, seemingly out of nowhere. Well, the assumption is they were caught out on the cliff trail. A rogue wave. Both of them were swept out to sea. Horrific." Jack thought of the cut lock, the scrubbed floors, the smashed electronics in the cellar, the arterial spray on the wall. He thought of the photograph of Maya now safe in his pocket. "A squall," Jack repeated. The words sounded flat and dead in the air. "Yes, tragic." Sterling clapped his hands together, the friendly mask snapping back into place. "In fact, that's partly why I'm here. This place. It's a sad monument now, and frankly, my company is working with the state on a new initiative, preserving historical maritime sites." He took a half step closer. Ranger's growl escalated to a snarl. Sterling stopped, eyeing the dog. "My foundation is authorized to purchase sites of historical significance. I know what you paid for this place at the government auction. It was a steal." He quoted the exact price, the second red flag. "I'm prepared to offer you double that, right now. A cashier's check is with my pilot. Consider it a finder's fee. You walk away with a handsome profit, and we turn this sad place into a proper memorial for the Chen family." The offer was too clean, the story too neat. Sterling wasn't here to preserve history. He was here to bury it. He had expected to find the property empty, not occupied by a seal and his working dog. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Sterling," Jack said, his voice even. "But I just got here. I came here for the quiet. I think I'll keep it." Sterling's smile tightened at the corners. It was the micro-expression of a man who had never been told no. "Mr. Cole," Sterling said, his voice losing its fabricated warmth. "I don't think you understand. This peninsula is unstable. The cliffs are eroding. The storms are getting worse. It's not a safe place for one man. It's isolated, dangerous." The bodyguard, who had been perfectly still, shifted his weight. "I can handle isolation," Jack replied. Sterling stared at him for a long, silent moment. He was recalculating. This was not the simple civilian he had expected. He looked at Ranger, who was now showing a significant amount of teeth. He looked at Jack's cold, steady eyes. "Very well," Sterling said, his charm completely gone. His face became a cold, impassive mask. The offer stands, but I wouldn't get too comfortable. He turned away, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel path. The coast is treacherous, he called back over his shoulder. It takes what it wants. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Sterling and his bodyguard climbed back into the Augusta. The door slid shut, the engine roared to life, and the helicopter lifted into the air. It banked forward and disappeared back into the rain as quickly as it had come. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crashing waves. Jack stood motionless for a long time, the rotor wash still swirling around him. He gave Ranger a firm scratch on the neck. "Good boy," Jack whispered. "You were right." He looked at the small wooden cabin, with its smell of bleach and blood. He looked at the cliff's edge where Sterling said a wave had claimed a family. He knew with the cold certainty of a man who had seen evil in many forms that Marcus Sterling was not just a concerned neighbor. He was the storm. The sound of the helicopter faded, swallowed by the rain until only the eternal roar of the Pacific remained. For a long time, Jack Cole didn't move. He stood on the damp grass, a statue of quiet fury, Ranger pressed against his leg. Marcus Sterling's last words, "The coast takes what it wants," echoed in his mind. It was a threat wrapped in a poetic lie. Jack was a man who dealt in facts, not poetry. The facts were simple. A professionally cleaned murder scene, destroyed communications, and a billionaire who appears out of the rain with a fabricated story and an offer that felt like a payoff. Sterling's story was a lie. Lies leave a trail. He had to find it. "Come on, Ranger," Jack said, his voice low and hard. "Let's take a walk." He didn't head for the jeep. He turned toward the cliff's edge, the direction of the so-called rogue wave. Ranger, sensing the shift in his handler's demeanor from defensive to predatory, trotted ahead, his nose to the ground. The cliff top was a narrow, treacherous path, slick with sea spray and moss. To their left, the land sloped away. To their right, a sheer 70-foot drop to the churning water and jagged black rocks below. This was the path David Chen and his daughter Maya were supposed to have been on when the storm hit. Jack's eyes scanned every inch of ground. He was looking for signs of a struggle. Scuffed earth, scrape marks, anything out of place. But the recent rain and constant mist had washed the landscape clean. There was nothing. He walked the full length of the peninsula's edge, a quarter-mile of deadly footing. Ranger moved with him, a silent shadow, occasionally stopping to sniff a patch of sea grass or a rock outcropping, but finding nothing of interest. They reached the farthest point of land, where the lookout had its most commanding view of the ocean, and turned back. Jack was beginning to think Sterling's men had been as thorough outside as they had been inside. Then Ranger stopped. He was 20 yards ahead near a section where the cliff path narrowed dangerously. The dog wasn't sniffing the ground. He was at the very edge of the cliff. Looking down, his head cocked. He let out a single, sharp bark. "What is it, buddy?" Jack called, quickening his pace. Ranger barked again, a more insistent sound, and pawed at the rock, his claws making a scraping sound. He was agitated, his attention riveted on something directly below him on the cliff face. Jack reached the spot and looked over the edge. The cliff face was a near vertical wall of glistening black rock covered in slick algae and bird droppings. The tide was coming in and the waves hammered the base of the cliff, sending up explosions of white spray that shot halfway up the wall. He followed Ranger's gaze. About 30 feet down, tucked into a deep vertical crevice partially shielded from the main force of the surf, something was caught. It was a patch of black synthetic fabric snagged on a sharp outcropping of rock. It was a bag. A normal person would have written it off as ocean trash. A normal person would not have been able to reach it. Jack was not a normal person. "Good boy," he said, giving Ranger a hard pat. "Good find. Now stay here." "Stay." Ranger whined, but obeyed, lying down a safe distance from the edge, his eyes tracking Jack's every move. Jack took off his jacket. He didn't have a harness or climbing gear, but he had 8 years of navigating far worse terrain. He scanned the rock face, mapping a route in his mind, handholds, footholds, cracks and ledges. He saw a path. He lay on his stomach and lowered himself over the edge, his fingers finding a solid grip in a cold, wet crack. His boots scraped against the rock, searching for purchase. He found a small ledge just big enough for the toes of one boot. He began his descent. It was a controlled fall, a deadly vertical dance. His fingers, raw and numb from the cold, clawed for purchase. The sea spray was a constant mist on his face, blurring his vision. The roar of the surf below was a deafening, hungry sound. One slip, one moment of lost concentration, and the rocks would do the rest. He moved with the disciplined, practiced grace of an elite operator. He trusted his strength, his training, and his absolute focus. After 5 minutes that felt like an hour, he was level with the crevice. He braced himself with one hand and one foot and reached into the crack. His fingers touched the cold, rubberized texture of a waterproof dry bag. It was wedged tight. He had to yank, feeling the fabric scrape against the sharp rock. It came free with a sudden jolt that almost sent him flying backward into the void. He tucked the bag under his arm, his muscles screaming in protest, and began the slow, grueling climb back up. He hauled himself over the lip of the cliff, gasping for breath, his body soaked in sweat and seawater. He collapsed on the wet grass, his lungs burning. Ranger was on him instantly, licking his face, whining with relief. Jack lay there for a long moment, the gray sky spinning above him. Then he sat up and looked at his prize. It was a high-quality, tactical dry bag, the kind used for maritime operations. He unrolled the top and opened it. Inside was not the kind of gear a normal caretaker would own. First, there was a Garmin Fortrex 401, a small, wrist-mounted GPS unit that was standard issue for many military units. It was rugged, waterproof, and designed for tactical use. Beneath it, neatly coiled, was 50 feet of thin but incredibly strong static climbing rope, with a small grappling hook attached to one end. This wasn't for hiking. This was for scaling walls, for emergency ascents or descents. Jack lifted the items out, his mind racing. Marcus Sterling's story of a rogue wave wasn't just a lie. It was now an insult. You don't get accidentally swept off a cliff by a squall when you have professional climbing equipment in a bag. You don't lose your military-grade GPS in a surprise storm. This gear wasn't lost in an accident. It was ditched, discarded in a hasty escape, or more likely, thrown over the edge by the killers to dispose of evidence. They had made a mistake. They assumed the sea would take it, hide it forever. They hadn't counted on a stubborn crevice, and they hadn't counted on a dog with a very good nose. Jack looked at the grappling hook in his hand. He imagined David Chen, the man in the photograph, using this to secure himself and his daughter while working on the cliffs. Or maybe Maya, the smiling girl, was the climber. They weren't victims of the sea. They were fighters. They had tried to escape. He got to his feet, the evidence in his hand, and looked back at the small wooden cabin. The pieces were falling into place. Sterling wanted this piece of land. The cons wouldn't sell. Sterling sent a professional team to remove them. They fought back. Something went wrong. The cleanup was thorough, but not perfect. And they'd left a survivor. He knew it with absolute certainty. The bag, the gear. It was a loose end. And there was only one reason you get that careless with evidence like this. You're chasing someone. Maya. The light failed. The darkness didn't just fall. It rose from the sea, a physical black mist that swallowed the entire peninsula. The wind picked up, howling now, and the first real drops of the coming storm began to lash against the rock. Jack had made his decision. The cabin was a compromised area, a tomb. The tower was wood, iron, and defensible. It was their fortress. He and Ranger were at the base of the spiral staircase, a small, defensible area near the heavy steel door. Jack sat on the bottom step, wiping down the tactical gear he'd recovered. The Garmin GPS was waterlogged and dead. Its screen was cracked, but the rope and hook were intact, professional grade, an escape artist's kit. His mind was on the girl in the picture. Maya, if she had this gear, she was a fighter. If she was a fighter, she might still be alive, hiding, waiting. Ranger, who had been curled at his feet, suddenly went rigid. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a growl. It was a sound Jack knew intimately. A soft huff of air from the dog's nose and a silent lift of the head. His ears swiveled, locking onto the sound of the wind and rain beating against the steel door. Jack held his breath. He put a hand on Ranger's back, feeling the tremor of contained energy. Ranger was listening to something underneath the storm. Jack killed his flashlight, plunging the base of the tower into absolute darkness. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the cold steel. For a moment, nothing but the shriek of the wind. Then a new sound, a metallic scraping coming from the direction of the cabin. Someone was trying to pry open the back door of the Ranger's cabin. Jack's blood ran cold. Sterling hadn't waited. He'd sent his team back to finish the job, to find the loose end. He cracked the tower door an inch. A sliver of the storm-tossed night was visible. The cabin was a dark shape 50 yards away. Ranger was at his heel, trembling. A low growl was now rumbling in his chest. Then Jack saw it. A figure, small and hunched against the rain, detached itself from the rocks at the cliff's edge and darted toward the cabin. Not a team of killers, a single person. The figure reached the cabin's back door, the one that led out to the cliffs, and fumbled with something at the handle. Jack acted. Go. The command was explosive. Ranger launched out of the tower door like a black and tan missile, covering the distance to the cabin in seconds. Jack was right behind him, K-bar in hand, the wind tearing at his clothes. The figure at the door spun around, startled. They saw the dog and let out a small cry of terror. They didn't run for the cliffs, a dead end. They didn't run for Jack, a threat. They ran for the only available shelter, the open steel door of the lookout tower. It was a trap. They had just cornered themselves. The figure scrambled into the tower and slammed the heavy door shut, plunging the interior back into blackness just as Ranger hit it with a heavy thud. Jack reached the door and shoved it open. Ranger was already inside, scrambling up the spiral staircase. Jack followed, taking the steps two at a time, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. Ranger, down, hold. He heard frantic scrambling above him, boots slipping on iron, a sharp, ragged gasp for breath. The intruder was fast, moving with a desperate, panicked agility. They were climbing, trying to get to the top. Jack burst into the observation room. The storm was raging outside. Rain and sea spray hammered against the thick glass panes, and the wind howled like a banshee. The huge brass alidade sat in the center of the room, still and dark. Ranger had the intruder cornered against the far windows. Don't move. Jack yelled, centering the flashlight beam. The light illuminated not a trained killer, but a young woman. She was thin, almost skeletal, her face smeared with dirt and grime. She wore tattered, soaking wet clothes that were far too big for her. In her hand, she held a rusted piece of metal, a broken shackle, wielding it like a knife. Her dark hair was a tangled mess and her eyes were wide, wild, and all pupil. It was the girl from the photograph. But the smile was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out terror. This was Maya Chen. Get back! She screamed, her voice cracking. Stay away from me. Ranger was in full protection mode, barking and snarling, showing his teeth, waiting for the command to attack. Ranger, sit. Stay, Jack ordered. The dog stopped barking but remained in a low crouch, every muscle tensed. Maya, Jack said, keeping his voice calm, the flashlight beam steady. My name is Jack. I'm not going to hurt you. Liar, she spat, brandishing the shackle. Sterling sent you. He sent you to find me. I don't work for Sterling. Jack lied, his mind racing. He saw a dark, wet stain on her left sleeve, a makeshift bandage wrapped around her forearm. She was injured and on the verge of collapse. They killed him, she whispered, her gaze darting between Jack and the dog. They killed my dad. They threw him. They threw him from the rocks. Her adrenaline-fueled strength suddenly gave out. Her legs buckled. She slid down the glass wall, the shackle clattering to the floor. She dropped her head to her knees, her body racked with dry, exhausted sobs. The threat was gone. Ranger's entire demeanor changed. The snarling stopped. The rigid, aggressive posture softened. He let out a low, confused whine. He took one hesitant step forward, then another. He gently nudged her trembling hand with his wet nose. Maya flinched, looking up in terror, but Ranger just whined again, a soft, sympathetic sound, and licked her hand. That was the signal. Jack clipped the flashlight to his belt, plunging the room into a softer, ambient light from the storm outside. He sheathed his knife. Ranger, good boy. Stay. The dog lay down, his eyes fixed on the girl, his tail giving a single, uncertain thump. Jack unzipped his heavy jacket. He moved slowly, his hands visible. Maya, look at me. She looked up, her eyes blurred with tears and terror. You're safe now, he said. He knelt, not too close, and placed his jacket on the floor beside her. I don't work for Sterling. I bought this place. I found the house. I found the bag your father hid. Her head snapped up at that. The bag? The climbing gear on the cliff. He pointed to her arm. You're hurt. She instinctively covered the wound. I have a first aid kit, he said gently. Let me see it, please. You're bleeding. She stared at him, then at the dog who was watching her with concern. She was trembling violently from cold and shock. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Jack took his jacket and gently draped it over her shaking shoulders. She flinched at his touch but didn't pull away, clutching the warm, dry fabric. He pulled his personal med kit from a pocket. This is going to sting a bit, he said. He carefully cut away the filthy makeshift bandage. Underneath was a deep, ragged gash, red and inflamed. It was several days old. The metal did this? He asked quietly. When I was climbing back up after they left, she whispered, her teeth chattering. He cleaned the wound, her sharp intake of breath the only sound besides the storm. He applied antiseptic and a fresh pressure dressing, his movements practiced and sure. He saw the strength in her, this girl who had hidden, who had climbed a sheer cliff face while injured, who had survived on her own for days or weeks. But he also saw the deep, bottomless terror in her eyes. The terror of a child who had watched her world be destroyed. His mission had just changed. This was no longer a property dispute. You've been out here this whole time, he said, his voice husky with a new emotion. Hiding in the cliffs, she nodded, pulling his jacket tighter. In the caves. I came back for food from the house. I didn't know anyone was here. I'm here now, Jack said. He sat back on his heels, giving her space. You're safe, Maya. I promise you. I won't let them hurt you. She looked from his face to the calm, watchful dog, and for the first time in weeks, the terror in her eyes receded, replaced by a fragile, desperate flicker of hope. The observation room was a fragile island of safety in a sea of chaos. Outside, the storm raged, a symphony of screaming wind and crashing water. Inside, there was only the sound of Maya's ragged breathing and the soft, rhythmic thump of Ranger's tail on the iron floor. The dog had not left her side. Jack had just finished dressing the wound on her arm. He'd worked with a dispassionate efficiency that she seemed to find reassuring. Done, he said, his voice low. That'll hold until we can get you to a doctor. There is no we, she whispered, pulling his heavy jacket tighter around her thin shoulders. And there are no doctors. There's only them. Jack sat back on his heels, giving her space. Sterling, what does he want, Maya? Why this place? Why kill your father for a worthless piece of rock? She turned away, her gaze fixed on the storm-lashed windows. For a long moment she was silent, lost in a memory. It's not the rock, she finally said, her voice barely audible over the wind. It's what's under it. Under the water. She took a shuddering breath. My dad, he wasn't just a caretaker. He was a signals analyst in the Navy, a signals expert. He loved this place because it was quiet. He could listen. He monitored shipping lanes, weather patterns, radio frequencies, everything. About 6 months ago, he picked up something new. A new signal? No, a new silence, she corrected. A survey ship owned by a shell corporation was mapping the seabed just offshore, but it wasn't mapping for oil or gas. It was mapping for a cable. Jack felt the pieces click into place. Sterling's undersea cable project. Maya nodded, her eyes wide. It was supposed to make landfall 50 miles north at a major hub. That was the public plan. But that was a lie. My dad found the real survey markers. The cable, the main trunk line, is being laid right through the channel at the base of this cliff. This lookout, it was the perfect secret landing station, untraceable, off the grid. The audacity of the plan was staggering. He wanted to tap the line. More than tap it, she said, her voice trembling with the ghost of her father's outrage. He wanted to build a ghost station, a private data mine. He was going to pull a fiber from the main cable onto this peninsula, process it here, and send it back out. No one would ever know. He would have access to everything. Financial data, government communications, private messages, a secret river of the world's secrets flowing right under our feet. A fortune beyond measure, and the power to match. It was motive for murder. My dad found out, she continued, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. He tried to warn someone, but Sterling owns everyone in the local port authority. So, Sterling came himself. He made my dad an offer, a life of wealth, to just walk away and forget what he'd seen. And your father refused. He told Sterling this lookout wasn't for sale, she whispered. He said some things were more important than money. The memory became too much. Her fragile composure finally shattered. So, Sterling sent his monster. Who? Jack asked, his voice sharp. Give me a name, Maya. She flinched at his tone, but she answered. He called himself Silas. She described him not by his face, but by his presence, a man who moved with no wasted motion, his eyes like chips of ice. He wasn't loud or angry. He was quiet, efficient, and methodical as he and his men, all in dark tactical gear, stormed their home. He didn't even see my dad as a person, she sobbed, her body shaking. He just looked at him like a problem, an obstacle to be removed. He held a gun on me while his men. She couldn't finish. She choked on the words. Jack felt a cold, familiar rage settle in his gut. He knew men like Silas. He had fought them, and he had killed them. They were the soulless, the hollowed-out men who did the dirty work for powerful cowards like Sterling. He was no longer just a man on leave. He was an operator again. And he had a new mission. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for the terrified, brave young woman huddled in his jacket. "Where were you when it happened?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. He needed intel. "In the caves," she said, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "The climbing gear was mine. Dad was teaching me. I was practicing on the west face when they arrived. I saw their boat. I hid. I watched them. I heard everything." Her story, the horror of it, hung in the air between them. Jack didn't offer sympathy. He offered the only thing he had. "They made a mistake," he said, his voice hard as iron. "They left a witness, and now they have me." As the words left his lips, Ranger, who had been lying quietly, shot to his feet. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking out the storm-lashed windows toward the sea. Jack was on his feet instantly, pulling Maya behind him. He moved to the nearest window, wiping the condensation with his sleeve. At first he saw nothing but the churning black waves, their white caps illuminated by the occasional distant lightning flash. Then he saw them, 3 of them, low, black inflatable boats, cutting through the heavy surf with powerful outboard motors. Zodiacs, the workhorses of special operations units the world over. Each boat carried 4 men, dark shapes in tactical gear, their weapons at the ready. They weren't headed for the small natural harbor. They were headed for the base of the cliff directly below the lookout. They were coming for the bag. They were coming to sanitize the scene. They were coming to finish the job. "They're here." Maya breathed, her voice a ghost. Jack's mind exploded with tactical calculations. 3 boats, 12 men. They'd split up. 1 team to secure the cabin, 1 for the tower, 1 as a floating quick reaction force. They'd use Maya's climbing route to ascend the cliff. "We have the high ground, but we're trapped. 1 way in, 1 way out." The time for hiding was over. The time for running was done. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one about to break over them. Jack looked at Maya, her face pale in the gloom. The flicker of hope in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by the familiar, paralyzing terror. He put a hand on her shoulder. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice a calm, lethal promise. "They wanted this lookout. They're about to get it." The world outside the observation room became a tactical map of sound and light. Muffled shouts carried on the wind, the scrape of boots on rock, then a blinding flash from the direction of the cabin, followed a second later by the percussive bang of a flashbang grenade. "They're breaching the house," Jack said, his voice a low growl. He pulled Maya away from the window. "They think you're still in there, or they're looking for whatever your father hid." "There's nothing left to find," she whispered, her face ashen. "They took his research, his logs, everything." "They don't know that." Another flash illuminated the night. "They were being systematic. This is our chance. They're focused on the cabin. We have a window." "A window for what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're trapped." "No," Jack said, his eyes locking on hers. "You survived in the cliffs. You know this place better than they do. Is there another way out? A trail? A cave? Anything?" Hope warred with despair on her face. "There is one," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But we have to go back to the cabin, to the cellar." Of course, the one place the enemy was now occupying. A 50-yard sprint across storm-lashed open ground with a dozen trained killers just feet away. A suicide run. "Okay," Jack said as if she'd just suggested a walk on the beach. He turned to Ranger. "Buddy, this is gonna get loud." He looked back at Maya. "What's in the cellar?" "Behind the old shelves," she explained, her words coming faster. "There's a false wall. My great-grandfather built it during Prohibition. It's a tunnel. It leads down through the rock to a sea cave at the base of the cliff, a smuggler's cove. It was perfect. A ghost from the past, come to save them. On my signal," Jack instructed, his voice dropping into the calm, authoritative tone of command. "We run straight for the front door of the cabin. Don't stop for anything. Ranger will run with you. Understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide with terror, but a new flicker of resolve, too. Jack cracked the heavy tower door. The wind howled, trying to rip it from his hand. He peered out. The assault team was in the cabin. He could see the flashing beams of their weapon-mounted lights dancing across the windows. 2 men were posted outside the rear, watching the cliffs. The front was currently clear. "Ready," he whispered. Maya took a deep, shuddering breath. Go. They burst from the tower. The world dissolved into a chaos of wind, rain, and heart-pounding fear. Jack ran a step behind Maya, his body a shield. Ranger was a low, black and tan blur, pacing her perfectly. The wet grass was slick, treacherous. The noise of the storm was a blessing, covering the sound of their frantic footsteps. They reached the cabin door, the one Jack had pushed open an eternity ago. He shoved Maya inside, Ranger at her heels, and then he was in, slamming the door behind them. The sounds from the other room were louder now, furniture being overturned, muffled professional voices calling out cleared sectors. Kitchen clear, bedroom clear. They had seconds before they were discovered. Cellar, Jack hissed. Maya was already moving, pulling back the rug, her hands fumbling with the recessed ring on the trapdoor. Jack joined her, and they heaved the door open. Go, he urged. She scrambled down the ladder into the pitch-black cellar. Ranger, after a moment's hesitation, leapt down after her. Jack followed, pulling the trapdoor closed over their heads, plunging them into absolute, suffocating darkness. The sounds from above were muffled now, but closer. Heavy boots stomped on the floorboards directly over their heads. Jack flicked on his maglite, keeping the beam aimed at the floor. The wall, he whispered. Where? Maya pointed to a set of damp, rotting shelves against the far stone wall. Behind that. Together, they pushed. The shelving scraped against the rock and pivoted inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow, dark opening. A draft of cool, salty air, smelling of salt and ancient, undisturbed earth, rushed over them. I haven't been in here since I was a kid, she breathed. No time like the present, Jack said, gently pushing her toward the opening. You lead. I'm right behind you. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for one person. The walls were slick with moisture, and the floor was uneven rock. Maya moved with a certainty born of childhood memory, her hand tracing the right-hand wall. Jack followed, the beam of his flashlight dancing ahead of them. Ranger was a tense presence between them. They'd gone 100 feet when Maya's foot slipped on a patch of wet moss. Her ankle twisted and she cried out, stumbling forward. Jack's arm shot out, his hand clamping around her bicep, steadying her before she could fall. He held her there for a second, his grip firm and sure. In the close confines of the tunnel, he could feel the violent tremor of her body, not just from cold, but from bone-deep exhaustion. I've got you, he said, his voice a low rumble. She looked back, her face a pale oval in the reflected light. I'm okay, she whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. He didn't let go. He simply shifted his grip, supporting her. We're almost there, he promised. A promise he had no way of knowing if he could keep, but it was the only thing he had to offer. Her hand came up and rested on his for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement, a transfer of trust. In that touch, in the shared darkness, a bond was forged, stronger than the rock around them. Another 50 feet, and they could hear it. The muffled roar of the surf growing louder. They saw a faint gray light ahead. The exit. They emerged from the tunnel into a sea cave as large as a cathedral. The exit to the ocean was a wide mouth, its teeth the storm-lashed black rocks. A strip of beach littered with driftwood and seaweed was the only solid ground. They had made it. For a moment, a wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over Jack, and then a voice, calm and utterly devoid of emotion, spoke from the shadows near the mouth of the cave. I was wondering when you'd show up. A figure stepped into the gray light. He was a powerfully built man in matte black tactical gear, his face clean-shaven, his head shaved bald. His eyes were a flat, pale gray, as cold and empty as the storm-tossed sea. He held a suppressed pistol, not aimed at Jack, but pointed casually at the floor. This was Silas. And he wasn't alone. 2 of his men flanked him, their rifles up. He had anticipated the escape route. He hadn't sent his whole team into the cabin. He'd left a welcoming party. Silas's dead eyes moved from Jack to Maya, a flicker of professional annoyance crossing his features. Sterling doesn't like loose ends, he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. And you, little girl, have been a particularly stubborn one. He raised the pistol, the muzzle now perfectly aligned with Maya's chest. Ranger, who had been silent, launched himself forward. A blur of fur and fury, a roar of primal rage erupting from his throat. The fight Jack had been running to had finally arrived. Time seemed to slow. The sea cave was a tableau of imminent violence. Silas's cold, dead eyes. The black muzzle of his pistol aimed at Maya and the 90-pound blur of Ranger hurtling across the wet sand. The suppressed pistol coughed. A sharp thwip. The round wasn't for Maya. It was for the dog. Ranger yelped, a sound of sharp, sudden pain as the bullet grazed his shoulder. His attack faltered for a microsecond, his momentum carrying him past Silas's leg instead of into his chest. Silas kicked out, a brutal, efficient kick that sent the dog tumbling. Jack was already moving. He didn't go for Silas. He shoved Maya back toward the relative safety of the tunnel entrance and then launched himself at the mercenary to Silas's right. He hit the man like a freight train, driving him back into the cave wall. The man's rifle discharged into the rock, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Jack's K-bar was in his hand, and he moved with the brutal efficiency of close-quarters combat. It was over in 3 seconds. Silas turned, his empty gray eyes registering the loss of his man with cold annoyance. The second mercenary was bringing his rifle to bear on Jack. And then the world exploded. A light so brilliant it was like the sun being born inside the cave flooded the entire space. It came from the sea from a massive searchlight that turned the raging storm into a silver and black backdrop. Simultaneously, a voice, amplified by a bullhorn, boomed from the cave mouth, seeming to shake the very rock. FBI, drop your weapons. I repeat, drop your weapons. You are surrounded. From the dark mouth of the smuggler's tunnel behind them, a second powerful beam of light stabbed into the cave, pinning Silas and his remaining man in a blinding crossfire. Figures in dark tactical gear, FBI stenciled in bold white letters across their chests, poured out of the tunnel. From the sea, a U.S. Coast Guard cutter, its deck swarming with armed men, held its position just outside the breakers, its searchlight unwavering. Silas didn't panic. He simply processed the new reality. He had walked into a trap. He raised his pistol, not at the FBI, but at Maya. The final act of defiance of a man who erased his mistakes. He never fired. Ranger, blood matting the fur on his shoulder, was back up. With a final, desperate lunge, he leapt up and clamped his powerful jaws around Silas's gun arm. Silas roared in pain and surprise as his wrist snapped, the pistol clattering to the wet sand. The FBI team swarmed in, and the fight was over. Jack ignored the shouting, the clatter of gear, the splash of boots in the shallow water. He went straight to Ranger, who had let go and was now limping, whining softly. "You're okay, buddy. You're okay," Jack whispered, running his hands over the dog, assessing the wound. It was a deep graze, bleeding freely, but the bullet had gone through muscle, painful, but not life-threatening. Maya was at his side instantly, her hands hovering over the dog, her face a mask of anguish and gratitude. "He saved me," she whispered. "He saved us." A man in a windbreaker with FBI on the back approached them. He was in his late 40s with thinning hair and a tired, academic face that looked more suited to a library than a tactical raid. Jack recognized him instantly. It was the man from the online property auction, the government surplus agent who had finalized the sale. "Mr. Cole," the man said, his voice calm and weary. "I'm Agent Miller. I owe you an apology." "You used me," Jack said. "It wasn't a question." "We did," Miller admitted without shame. "We've been building a case against Sterling for 2 years. His data breach operation was a ghost. We knew he needed a physical access point, and our intel led us here. We knew about the cons, but we couldn't move without proof." He gestured to the subdued mercenaries being led away in cuffs. "Silas's team is famously clean. They don't leave witnesses, but our sources confirmed they made a mistake here. They lost someone, the girl." Miller looked at Maya with a professional sympathy. "We knew they'd be back to sanitize the scene. We just needed a trigger, a new owner, someone with a background who could plausibly handle themselves if things went sideways before we could intervene. Your service record made you the perfect candidate. We flagged the property auction, made sure you were the only bidder." So, the low price hadn't been a stroke of luck. It had been an invitation. Jack had been the bait on a multi-million-dollar fishing trip. "What about Sterling?" Jack asked, his voice hard. Miller allowed himself a small, tired smile. "While his attack dogs were busy here, another team was boarding his yacht, which was waiting for a situation report 3 miles offshore. Mr. Sterling is currently explaining the concept of plausible deniability to a federal magistrate. It's not going well for him." The storm had broken. The first fragile light of dawn was beginning to pierce the eastern clouds, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. The rain had softened to a drizzle. Later, after the cave had been cleared and Silas's men had been taken away after a medic had stitched and bandaged Ranger's shoulder, Jack and Maya stood on the cliff path, watching the Coast Guard cutter pull away. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a strange sense of peace. The world felt new, washed clean by the storm. Ranger sat between them, leaning heavily against Jack's leg. They offered me witness protection, Maya said, her voice small. She was wearing a warm, dry FBI jacket, but she still looked impossibly fragile against the vastness of the ocean. Are you going to take it? Jack asked. She shook her head, not looking at him, but at the lookout tower, her home. No, I'm done hiding. I'm staying. I'm going to testify for my dad. Jack nodded, understanding completely. Good. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the sound of the receding tide. My leave is up, Jack said finally, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I'm supposed to be back in Coronado in a week. He felt her stiffen beside him. He turned to look at her. To really see her in the clean light of the new day. He saw the strength that had been forged in terror, the intelligence in her eyes, the resilience of a spirit that refused to be broken. But I'm not going, he continued, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Not yet. I have to give a statement, a long one, and I need to make sure my dog gets the best veterinary care in the state. That could take a while. At least until the trial is over. She looked up at him then, and the weary sadness in her eyes was finally replaced by something else. A small, hesitant, but beautiful smile. It was the smile from the photograph. She didn't say, thank you. She didn't have to. He didn't say he would protect her. He didn't have to. In the quiet of the dawn, standing on the edge of the world that had almost ended for them both, they looked at each other. A promise was made, silent and profound. A new future began right where a terrible past had ended. The lookout tower stood behind them, no longer a monument to tragedy, but a beacon of hope against the coming day. In our own lives, we all face moments that feel like that dark, isolated lookout tower. We may feel abandoned or face storms that seem too powerful to survive. But this story teaches us that evil only triumphs when good people do nothing. Jack and Ranger were not afraid to face the darkness to bring the truth to light. We are all called to be guardians for the innocent and a voice for the truth in our own worlds. We pray that God will bless you and your family. May He give you the courage of Jack and the resilience of Maya. And may He always send a loyal friend like Ranger to be by your side.